The Wyoming wind did not blow so much as it scoured. It carried the grit of 3 territories, picking up alkali dust and the dried husks of sagebrush to hurl them against the rough-hewn logs of the Sweetwater stage stop. To the west, the mountains were not majestic purple sentinels, but jagged teeth biting into the belly of a sky that was too blue, too vast, and entirely indifferent to the humans who tried to live beneath it. Eli Mercer leaned against the hitching post, the wood smooth and gray under his gloved hand. He adjusted the brim of his hat, squinting against the glare, the pain in his left leg, the legacy of a horse that had panicked in a drift 3 winters back, throbbed with a dull, rhythmic ache. It made him feel older than his 34 years. It made him feel worn down, like the fence posts that leaned drunkenly along the road to town. He was waiting for a wife. The notion sat in his gut like a stone he had swallowed and could not digest. He had not wanted this. He had told himself for 5 years that he was done with the softness of women, done with the terror of loving something that this country could snap in half with a single blizzard. But the ranch was failing. The house was falling into a silence so deep it rang in his ears, and he needed help. A partner, a woman to manage the accounts and the hens and the emptiness while he tried to keep the cattle alive. The stagecoach appeared first as a brown smudge on the horizon, a darker bruise against the tan earth. Then came the sound, a low rumble that grew into the clatter of wheels and the heave of exhausted horses. Eli straightened, brushing the dust from his vest. He had worn his Sunday black coat, though the seams were white with wear and the elbows shone. He felt foolish. He felt like a man walking to the gallows who had bothered to polish his boots. The coach lurched to a halt in front of the station, the driver spitting a stream of tobacco juice into the dirt before wrestling the brake lever. The door swung open, and a cloud of dust billowed out, followed by a salesman with a sample case, a miner headed for the hills, and finally, her. Maggie O'Rourke stepped down into the Wyoming dirt. She was not what he had pictured. The letters had been practical, penned in a neat, cramped hand that spoke of sewing skills and a willingness to work. He had expected someone sturdy, perhaps a widow with the thick waist and red hands of a farm wife. Maggie was thin. That was the first thing he noticed. She was slender in a way that spoke of city hunger, not country lean. Her dress was a dark gray wool, neat and mended, but too heavy for the heat and too fine for the brush. She turned to look at the driver handing down her trunk, a single, battered thing with brass corners that had seen better days, and Eli saw her profile. It was sharp, pale, and possessed of a terrified grace. He stepped forward, his boots crunching on the gravel. "Miss O'Rourke," he said. It was not a question. His voice sounded rusty to his own ears. She turned. Her eyes were green, the color of the moss that grew on the north side of the creek stones, but they were shadowed by something dark and frantic. She looked at him, taking in the scar that cut through his left eyebrow, the dust on his coat, the stiffness of his stance. "Mr. Mercer," she replied. Her voice was low, with a distinct lilt of the Irish tenements, though she tried to flatten it. "I am Eli Mercer. I am Margaret. Maggie." She held out a hand. It was not the soft hand of a lady of leisure, nor the broad hand of a dairymaid. It was small, but the fingers were roughened, the tips pricked and calloused, needle scars, factory hands. He took her hand for a second, feeling the tremors in her skin, and then released it as if he had been burned. The silence that followed was heavy. The wind filled it, whistling through the spokes of the wagon wheels. "Let us get your trunk," Eli said abruptly. "The horses are restless." Maggie watched him heave the heavy trunk onto the back of his buckboard wagon. She clutched her reticule with both hands, her knuckles white. Internally, she was fighting the urge to turn around and climb back into the stagecoach. New York had been a nightmare of smoke, noise, and the suffocating pressure of men who thought a woman without a family was public property. But this, she looked out at the horizon. There was no end to it. The land rolled away in every direction, brown and gray and gold, broken only by the skeletal shapes of scrub oak and the distant, mocking blue of the mountains. It looked empty, It looked like a place where a person could scream, and the sound would simply evaporate, unheard. She had traded the danger of too many people for the danger of none at all. Eli secured the trunk and gestured to the seat. She climbed up, wincing as the heat of the vinyl burned through her skirts. He climbed up beside her, the bench dipping under his weight. They did not touch, but she could smell him: leather, horse sweat, tobacco, and the dry scent of sage. "We have business in town first," Eli said, gathering the reins, "the license and supplies." She nodded, staring straight ahead. "I understand." The drive into the town of Bitter Creek took an hour. It was a collection of false-fronted buildings huddled together as if for protection against the wind. A church with a peeling white steeple stood at one end, a saloon with bat-wing doors at the other, and a mercantile in between. As they rode down the main street, Maggie felt the eyes. It was a sensation she knew well from the city, the feeling of being assessed. But here, in the quiet, it was more potent. Men stopped their conversations on the boardwalks to stare. It was not a welcoming gaze. It was a mixture of curiosity and a hungry, predatory appraisal. A woman sweeping the porch of the boarding house paused, leaning on her broom. She whispered something to the woman beside her, and they both looked at Maggie's travel-stained dress and the trunk in the back. The words floated on the dry air. Mail order, bought bride. Maggie kept her chin high, fixing her eyes on the ears of the horses. She had promised herself she would not cower. She had survived the fire that took her sister. She had survived the hungry winter that followed. She would survive these whispers. Eli pulled the wagon up in front of the mercantile. "Stay here," he said, but then he hesitated. "No, come in. You will need boots. Those shoes will not last a day on the ranch." She followed him into the dim, cool interior of the store. It smelled of coffee beans, calico, and pickle brine. The storekeeper, a balding man with spectacles, looked up and smiled. But the smile faltered when he saw Maggie. "Morning, Eli," the man said, wiping his hands on his apron. "This the lady?" "This is Miss O'Rourke," Eli said, his voice flat. "My betrothed." A silence stretched in the room. At the back of the store, a woman in a high-collared dress, the pastor's wife. Maggie guessed by the severity of her bonnet, turned to look. Her gaze raked over Maggie, noting the frayed hem of her sleeve, the weary slump of her shoulders, and the unmistakable stamp of poverty. The woman sniffed, a sharp, audible sound, and pointedly turned her back, occupying herself with a bolt of gingham. Maggie felt the heat rise in her cheeks. It was the same judgment she had fled, the assumption that because she was poor, because she was alone, because she had come from a place of smoke and sin, she was damaged goods, livestock to be traded. Eli seemed to stiffen. He placed a hand on the counter, the sound loud in the quiet room. "We need boots," Eli said, his voice hard. "Size 6, I reckon. And 50 pounds of flour, coffee, bacon, and sugar." The storekeeper scurried to comply. Maggie stood by a barrel of nails, trying to make herself small. Eli did not look at her, but she saw the muscle in his jaw jumping. He was ashamed of her, she thought. He was embarrassed to be seen with a stray cat he had ordered through the post. When the supplies were loaded, they walked to the small wooden church at the edge of town. The Reverend Thomas was waiting for them. He was a thin man with eyes that looked tired. The church was empty, the pews were dusty, and the air inside was stiflingly hot. There were no flowers, no music, no family to weep or smile. Just the three of them in the silent, judging presence of the empty cross on the wall. Reverend Thomas opened his book. "Deeply beloved. We are gathered here," he began, the words echoing hollowly against the bare wood. Maggie looked at Eli's hands. They were large, brown, and scarred from work. They hung at his sides, clenched into fists. As the Reverend asked for the ring, Eli fumbled in his vest pocket and produced a simple gold band, thin and old. "Give me your hand," Eli said. She held out her hand. It shook. As he slid the ring onto her finger, his own hand trembled. It was a violent tremor, a shudder that ran through his arm. His skin was warm and dry, rough against her own. For a second, he didn't let go. He held her fingers, his grip tight, almost desperate. She looked up at his face, but he was staring at the ring, his expression unreadable. "I pronounce you man and wife," the Reverend said. It was done. There was no kiss. Eli simply nodded to the preacher, placed a few coins on the altar, and turned to her. "We have a long ride, Mrs. Mercer." The name felt heavy, like a winter coat she hadn't chosen. "Yes, Mr. Mercer, Eli. You should call me Eli. Eli," she repeated. The word felt strange in her mouth. The ride to the ranch took the rest of the day. They left the town behind, and with it, the last vestiges of civilization. The road became a pair of ruts winding through the sagebrush. The sun began its slow descent, turning the world into a furnace of orange and blinding gold. Maggie watched the land change. It grew wilder, rockier. The grass was sparse, brown clumps clinging to the earth. Coyotes began to sing from the ridges, their yips and howls sounding like the laughter of madmen. Is it always this quiet?" she asked, her voice small against the vastness. Eli kept his eyes on the horizon. "The wind blows mostly. When it stops, yes, it is quiet. How far is the nearest neighbor?" 10 miles to the east, the Miller place, but they moved on last winter." "So we are alone," she said. Eli glanced at her then. "We are alone." The finality of it struck her. If she screamed here, no one would come. If she ran, there was nowhere to go. She was tethered to this stranger by a piece of paper and a gold ring. They crested a rise as the sun dipped below the mountains, painting the sky in bruises of purple and red. Below them, in a shallow valley, lay the ranch. Maggie's heart sank. She had not expected a palace, but she had hoped for a home. The house was a low, sprawling structure of weathered timber, the wood bleached gray by the sun. The roof of the porch sagged dangerously on one side. The fence lines that ran out from the barn were broken in places, wire trailing in the dirt. A windmill creaked dismally, turning lazily in the evening breeze. It looked defeated. It looked like a place where hope had come to die and had been buried in the yard. Eli pulled the horses up near the porch. He did not look at her. He looked at the house, and she saw the shame in his posture. "It needs work," he said gruffly. I have not had the time. Since—" He stopped. "Since the accident. Since she died." The words hung unsaid. "It is standing," Maggie said, forcing a strength into her voice she did not feel. "That is enough for a start." Eli looked at her, surprised. He nodded once, sharply. "I will take the horses to the barn. The door is unlocked." Maggie climbed down, her new boots stiff and hurting her feet. She walked up the steps, avoiding the rotted plank on the bottom, and pushed open the door. The inside was clean, but stark. A wood stove, a table with 2 chairs, a shelf of tattered books. There were no curtains on the windows, no rugs on the floor. It was a man's house, functional and barren. She stood in the center of the room, clutching her reticule, feeling the silence press against her ears. She was Mrs. Eli Mercer. She was the mistress of this broken kingdom. She took a breath, smelling the stale air of the house, wood smoke and loneliness. She set her bag on the table. She would not cry. She had promised herself on the train platform in New York that she was done crying. She walked to the stove and opened the firebox. Cold ash. She went outside to the wood pile. She would start a fire. She would make coffee. She would prove that she was not just a mouth to feed. By the time Eli came in from the barn, the lamps were lit and the coffee was boiling. He stopped in the doorway, blinking against the light. He looked at the table, set with 2 tin cups, and then at her. He looked exhausted. The lines around his eyes were deep trenches of shadow. "Thank you," he said. They ate a supper of cold biscuits and bacon in silence. Every scrape of the fork, every sip of coffee seemed deafening. When the meal was done, Eli stood up. He walked to a door on the far side of the room. "This is the bedroom," he said. Maggie followed him. It was a small room, dominated by a large iron bed covered in a quilt. A washstand stood in the corner. "It is nice," she said. Eli did not enter the room. He stood in the doorway, his hand gripping the frame. "You will sleep here," he said. Maggie turned to him, confusion knitting her brow. "And you? I will sleep in the bunkhouse, with the hands." Maggie felt a cold flush wash over her. "The bunkhouse? But we are married." Eli looked at the floor. "It is better this way. You need your rest. You do not know me. It is too soon to expect." He trailed off, his face flushing a dark red under the tan. Maggie felt the sting of rejection slap her across the face. She knew what this was. She had seen it in the eyes of the foreman at the factory, in the eyes of the landlord who had turned her and her sister out. He saw her. He really saw her. He knew she was a woman who had lived in the shadow of a brothel, a woman whose sister had died in a fire of sin. He thought she was unclean. He had married her for labor, but he would not share a bed with a fallen woman. She stiffened, her spine turning to steel. "I understand. Mr. Mercer," she said, her voice ice cold. "You need not explain." Eli looked up, seemingly about to speak, to correct her, but the wall between them was already up. He nodded. "Good night, Maggie, good night." He closed the door. She heard his heavy boots cross the main room, heard the front door open and close, and then silence. Maggie stood in the dark room. She did not undress. She sat on the edge of the bed, the springs groaning under her weight. The wind outside began to pick up, howling around the corners of the house, rattling the window pane like a thief trying to get in. She reached into her dress pocket and pulled out the locket. It was cheap brass, the metal turning green at the edges. She clicked it open. A tiny, tin-type face stared back at her, a girl with laughing eyes and a ribbon in her hair. Her sister. "Sarah, I made it. Sarah," she whispered to the picture. "I am here. I am a wife." She ran her thumb over the glass face. "He thinks I am dirt. Sarah, just like the others. But he gave me a roof. And I will work until my fingers bleed before I let him send me back. I will never go back." She snapped the locket shut and blew out the lamp. Darkness swallowed the room instantly. Outside, a coyote howled, close and sharp, and Maggie O'Rourke lay back on the strange bed, fully clothed, staring up into the blackness, listening to the wind try to tear the house down. She did not know yet that the wind was the least of her enemies. She did not know that the man sleeping in the bunkhouse was lying awake, staring at the ceiling, haunted not by her past, but by the ghost of a woman he had killed with his own stubbornness. All she knew was that the bed was cold. The room was vast, and she was more alone now than she had ever been in the crowded streets of New York. The first week on the Mercer Ranch was not a life. It was a war of attrition waged between Maggie O'Rourke and the Wyoming Territory. The enemy was not the wind or the coyotes, though they were constant companions. The enemy was the water. The well was located 300 yards from the back porch, a distance that seemed trivial until one had to traverse it 6 times a morning with 2 oak buckets sloshing against one's shins. The handle of the pump was rusted and stiff, requiring a full-body heave to draw the water up from the dark earth. Maggie learned quickly that the romance of the West was a lie told by people who had never scrubbed a man's heavy canvas trousers in a galvanized tub with lye soap that ate the skin off her knuckles. It was Tuesday, under a sun that felt like a hot iron pressing against the back of her neck. When the reality fully settled in, she was scrubbing Eli's work shirts, the water in the basin turning a murky gray. Her hands, once nimble enough to stitch lace on a silk bodice in the dim light of a New York tenement, were now red, swollen, and cracking. The dry air sucked the moisture right out of her flesh. A deep fissure had opened on her right thumb, stinging sharply every time the soapy water touched it. She paused, wiping sweat from her forehead with her forearm. leaving a streak of suds across her brow. She looked out at the horizon. It was endless. It was indifferent. It did not care that her back ached or that her skin felt 2 sizes too tight for her body. Eli was near the corral, repairing a section of fence where a spooked steer had broken the top rail. He paused in his work, leaning on the post driver, and watched her. He was too far away for her to see his eyes, but she felt the weight of his gaze. She straightened her spine. She would not let him see her slump. She would not let him think he had made a mistake in bringing her here. Eli watched the woman at the washboard. He had expected her to complain by now. He had expected tears, or a demand for a servant, or at least a plea for him to haul the water. But morning after morning, she marched to the well, her small boots kicking up dust, her jaw set in a line as rigid as the horizon. He felt a strange twisting in his chest. It was a mixture of admiration and guilt. He had brought her here to this hard place, to a house that was falling down and a husband who was hollowed out. He watched her wring out a heavy flannel shirt, her arms shaking with the effort. He dropped the post driver and walked toward her. His limp was more pronounced today. The dampness in the air from the coming weather made the old brake ache. "Leave that," he said as he approached. Maggie jumped, nearly dropping the shirt into the dust. She had not heard him over the scrubbing sound. She looked up, her eyes wide and guarded. "I am almost finished," she said. Eli reached out and took the wet shirt from her hands. His fingers brushed hers, rough skin against rough skin, and he saw the angry red crack on her thumb. He frowned, a deep furrow appearing between his brows. "Your hands are bleeding. It is nothing," she said quickly, pulling her hand back and hiding it in the folds of her apron. "The soap is strong. You are not used to this," he said. His voice was not unkind, but it was blunt. He hung the shirt on the line himself, securing it with a wooden peg. "I will haul the water tomorrow. I can do it. Eli, I am not an invalid." He looked at her then, really looked at her. Her face was flushed from the heat, strands of auburn hair escaping her bonnet to stick to her damp neck. There was a fire in her green eyes that startled him. "I know you are not," he said quietly, "but the water is heavy, and I need you to mend the grain sacks in the barn. That is work for nimble fingers, not brute strength." He turned and walked back to the corral before she could argue. He was retreating. He always retreated. Every time he felt the urge to offer comfort, to take her hand and look at the injury, a cold shudder slammed down in his mind. He saw Clara's face. He felt the phantom weight of a coffin. To be kind to this woman felt like a betrayal of the one he had buried. So he offered labor instead of tenderness, and walked away. Later that afternoon, Maggie found herself in the barn, surrounded by the smell of dry hay and horse manure. It was a good smell, earthy and honest. She sat on a crate, a pile of torn grain sacks at her feet, a heavy needle in her hand. The ranch hands were filtering in and out, preparing for the evening chores. There were 4 of them. Gus, the foreman, was a man in his 60s with a white mustache and a back permanently curved from decades in the saddle. Then there was Dutch, a quiet man who spoke only to horses, and a young, nervous boy named Billy. And then there was Shorty. Shorty was a man of 30 with a face like a crushed hat and eyes that were too close together. He leaned against a stall door, chewing on a piece of straw, watching Maggie sew. "So," he said, his voice loud enough to carry to the rafters, "the boss finally got his money's worth out of that catalog. Huh?" Maggie did not look up. She pushed the needle through the coarse burlap, pulling the thread tight. Shorty chuckled, looking around at the other men for approval. "I mean, $50 for a ticket and a ring. Cheaper than a prize heifer. And you get cooking thrown in." Gus, who was oiling a bridle nearby, cleared his throat. "Watch your mouth. Shorty, I'm just saying," Shorty continued, pushing off the stall and taking a step toward Maggie. "It is a business deal. Ain't that right, Mrs. Mercer? Just a business deal." Maggie stopped sewing. The barn went quiet. Even the horses seemed to stop chewing. She set the sack down on her lap and looked up at Shorty. Her face was calm, her expression unreadable. She stood up. She was a head shorter than him, but she held herself with the dignity of a queen. She walked over to where he had thrown his saddlebags on the ground. She picked them up. The leather was torn at the buckle, a jagged rip that rendered the bag useless. "Your gear is a disgrace." "Mister?" "Shorty," she said clearly. Shorty blinked, taken aback. "What? You're losing grain through this tear, and the leather is dry as a bone, if you treat your horse the way you treat your equipment. I pity the animal." She walked back to her crate, sat down, and threaded a new piece of heavy waxed twine. "Bring it here." Shorty stared at her. "What?" "I said bring it here. I can fix the tear with a double stitch. But you will have to oil it yourself. Unless you prefer to ride with gear that looks like it was chewed by a coyote." Gus let out a sharp, barking laugh. "Do as she says." "Shorty." Shorty turned red, his bluster deflating like a punctured lung. He mumbled something under his breath, picked up the saddlebags, and dropped them at her feet. "Thank you," Maggie said, not looking up. "It will be ready by supper." From the shadows of the tack room, Eli watched. He had been about to step out, to defend her, but she had not needed him. She had not cowered. She had taken the only weapon she had, her skill, and wielded it like a knife. He felt a strange swell of pride in his chest, followed immediately by that familiar, suffocating guilt. He turned and left through the back door before she could see him. The sky began to change 2 days later. It started in the west, a bruising of the horizon that looked like a storm front. But there were no clouds. The blue sky simply dissolved into a sickly, copper haze. The wind died down, and a strange, static silence fell over the ranch. The birds stopped singing. The cattle clustered together near the fences, their heads low. Maggie was in the garden, trying to coax life out of a row of wilting beans, when the light turned an eerie, filtered orange. She stood up, wiping her hands on her apron. Eli came running from the barn. He was not limping now. He was moving with urgent speed. "Maggie, get inside." She looked at him, confused. "Is it rain? Dust!" he shouted. He grabbed her arm, his grip hard enough to bruise. "Move!" He dragged her toward the house just as the wall of wind hit. It was not air, it was solid matter. A tidal wave of brown grit slammed into the ranch. The sun vanished instantly. The world went from afternoon to midnight in the span of a single breath. They tumbled through the front door, and Eli slammed it shut. Throwing the heavy iron bolt, the sound of the storm outside was a roar, a screaming, grinding noise, as if the earth itself were being sanded down. The house shook. The windows rattled in their frames, the glass singing with the vibration. "Get the towels," Eli ordered, his voice tight. "Wet them. Put them under the door and on the window sills. Hurry." Maggie scrambled to obey. She pumped water into a basin, soaked the rags she used for cleaning, and ran to the cracks where the dust was already spurting in like dark smoke. The air in the room was instantly thick, tasting of copper and old earth. She coughed, holding her apron over her nose. Eli was pushing a heavy chest of drawers against the north door. He looked at her, his face streaked with the fine powder that seemed to materialize out of thin air. "Are you all right?" he asked. "I think so," she coughed. "How long will it last? Hours, maybe a day. We just have to wait." They sat on the floor in the center of the room, away from the windows. The lamp Eli lit cast a dim, hazy halo in the dust-choked air. It was hot. The house, sealed up tight, began to bake. They sat in silence for a long time. The roar outside made talking difficult, but the silence between them was louder. Maggie was acutely aware of him. He was sitting with his back against the table leg, one knee drawn up. He looked powerful and trapped, like a wolf in a cage. "Thank you," she said, her voice muffled by the cloth she held to her face, "for coming to get me." Eli looked at her. His eyes were the only clear thing in the room. You would have been lost in 10 feet. A man can drown in dust just as easy as water. They sat like that as the afternoon wore on into evening. The light failed completely, leaving them in the absolute dark of the storm, save for the flickering lamp. The wind howled, a demonic sound that seemed to have a voice. As night fell, the temperature plummeted. It was a peculiarity of the high plains. The heat vanished with the sun, and the wind, driving down from the peaks, turned bitter. The house, usually drafty, was now a tomb of cold air that seeped through the floorboards despite their efforts. Eli stood up and fed the last of the wood into the stove, but the wind was sucking the heat right out of the chimney. He shivered. "I will sleep here," he said, gesturing to the braided rug near the stove. "It is the warmest spot." Maggie looked at the rug. It was thin. The floorboards were freezing. "You cannot sleep on the floor. Eli, it is freezing. I have slept in snowbanks. Maggie, I will be fine." He lay down, pulling his coat over him. He turned his back to her. Maggie went into the bedroom. It was like an icebox. She could see her breath in the lamplight. She crawled under the heavy quilt, shivering violently. She lay there for 10 minutes, her teeth chattering, thinking of the man in the other room. He was stubborn. He was a fool. And he was her husband. She threw back the covers and walked to the door. Eli. He did not move. "Go to sleep, Maggie. It is too cold. The fire is dying. You will freeze. I am fine." "You are not fine," she snapped, her fear making her bold, "and I am freezing. The quilt is heavy enough for two, but not for one in this cold." Eli rolled over. In the dim light from the stove vents, his face was unreadable. "Please," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. Just for the warmth. I do not ask for anything else." He hesitated. She saw the war in his eyes, the physical need for warmth battling the mental fortress he had built. Finally, with a heavy sigh, he stood up. He picked up his pillow. "Stay on your side," he said gruffly. "I will." They lay in the bed, the iron frame groaning as he settled his weight. They were stiff as corpses. A clear foot of space lay between them, a no-man's land of cold sheet. Maggie lay on her back, staring at the invisible ceiling. She could feel the heat radiating from him. It was a tantalizing, terrifying warmth. The wind shrieked outside, a lonely, desolate sound. "I hate the wind," Maggie whispered. It was not a conscious decision to speak. The words just leaked out of her loneliness. "It wears a person down," Eli said into the dark. "It sounds like New York," she said. "Not the wind, the noise, the constant noise. I thought coming here, I thought it would be peaceful." "Peace is something you carry inside," Eli said. "You cannot find it on a map." "I do not think I have ever carried it," she confessed. Silence stretched between them, but it was softer now. The cold forced them to be aware of their shared humanity. "My parents died when I was 12. She said the cholera took them both in a week. Sarah and I, we were alone." Eli did not speak, but he shifted slightly, turning his head toward her. "We worked in a shirt factory, 12 hours a day. My fingers were always bleeding then, too." She let out a dry, humorless laugh. "But the rent kept going up. And Sarah got sick. She needed medicine." She paused. The shame rose in her throat, hot and acrid, but the darkness gave her permission. She needed him to know. If he was going to reject her, let it be for the truth, not for the whispers of a town that didn't know her. "A man offered to help," she said, her voice trembling. "He owned the building," he said. "He said if I came to his rooms, he would forget the rent. He called himself a protector." She heard Eli's breath hitch. He went very still. "I did what I had to do, Eli. For Sarah, I am not a pristine woman. I have been used. And then he got tired of me. He kicked us out. Sarah found work in a house on the Bowery. She said it was better than starving." Tears leaked from the corners of her eyes, hot tracks on her cold skin. "The fire happened at night. They locked the doors from the outside to keep the girls from stealing. When the smoke started, there was no way out. I stood on the street and listened to them scream." She turned her head away from him, burying her face in the pillow. "So you see," she whispered, "I am tainted. I am dirty. That is why the town looks at me that way. Maybe they are right." For a long moment, there was only the sound of the wind. Then Eli spoke. His voice was rough, like gravel grinding together. "You are not dirty. Maggie, you survived." He took a breath, a shuddering intake of air. "I killed her," he said. Maggie froze. She turned her head back. "Who?" "Clara, my wife. It was 5 years ago," he continued, the words tumbling out as if a dam had broken. "She was 8 months with child. We were in town for supplies. The snow started falling around noon. The doctor told me to stay. He said a blizzard was coming, but I was arrogant. I wanted to be in my own bed. I thought I knew the weather better than anyone." He stopped. Maggie could feel the tension radiating off him. The muscles in his arm coiled tight. "I made her get in the wagon. She was scared. Maggie. She asked me to wait. I told her to trust me." His voice broke. It was a terrible sound. A man weeping without tears. The drifts were 4 feet deep within an hour. The wheel hit a hidden rock. The wagon tipped. She was pinned underneath. I tried to lift it. I tried for hours. She screamed for me to help her, and I couldn't. I held her hand while she froze to death. And the baby never took a breath. The silence in the room was absolute. The wind outside seemed to recede, irrelevant in the face of this cavernous grief. Eli turned his head. In the darkness, their faces were inches apart. She could feel his breath on her cheek. "I hear her screaming every time the wind blows," he whispered. "That is why I cannot. That is why I am half a man. I buried my heart in that drift." Maggie's heart hammered against her ribs. She reached out under the quilt. Her hand found his. It was cold and clenched into a fist. She covered it with her own. "You are not half a man," she said fiercely. "You are a man carrying a mountain." At her touch, a shock went through him. She felt his hand spasm, his fingers opening to grip hers. It was a desperate grip, painful and urgent. He shifted, his body turning toward her. For a heartbeat, the space between them vanished. He leaned in, his forehead resting against hers. She could feel the heat of him, the smell of soap and man and sorrow. She wanted him to hold her. She wanted to bury herself in his warmth and forget the cold, the dust, and the ghosts. "Eli," she breathed. He shuddered. His hand tightened on hers, pulling her slightly closer. He was on the precipice. He wanted her. God help him. He wanted her warmth, her living, breathing presence to chase away the ice in his soul. But then, the wind shrieked again. A loose shutter banged against the house. He froze. He pulled back as if she had burned him. He snatched his hand away and rolled onto his back, putting the distance back between them. "I cannot," he rasped. "I cannot." Maggie lay still, her hand still reaching into the empty space where his had been. The rejection stung, but it was different this time. It was not disgust. It was terror. "Sleep, Maggie," he said, his voice flat and hard. She curled into herself. "Good night, Eli." He did not answer. The next morning, the wind had died. The silence was back, but the air was still thick with suspended dust. They rose before the sun. The awkwardness in the kitchen was palpable, thick as the grit on the table. They moved around each other like repelling magnets. Careful not to touch, careful not to look too long. Eli drank his coffee standing up. Maggie fried the bacon, her eyes on the pan. "I will check the herd," Eli said, putting on his hat. "The dust, it confuses them. They might have scattered." Maggie nodded. "I will sweep the house. It will take all day." He walked to the door, then stopped. He did not turn around. "Maggie." "Yes?" He hesitated, his hand on the latch. "Leave the heavy rugs. I will beat them out when I return. Do not lift them yourself." He opened the door and walked out into the gray morning. Maggie stood by the stove, the spatula in her hand. A small, trembling smile touched her lips. It was not a declaration of love. It was not a kiss, but it was a kindness. He had seen her. He had remembered her burden. She looked at the empty doorway. The ghosts were still there, hovering in the corners of the room, but for the first time, they did not feel quite so invincible. She and Eli were two broken things in a broken land, but they had survived the night. And that, she decided as she reached for the broom, was a start. The weeks that followed the dust storm did not bring ease, but they brought a rhythm. The Wyoming spring did not arrive with the gentle green unfolding Maggie remembered from the parks of New York. It arrived with violence. The snow melt roared down from the high country, turning the dry creek beds into churning brown torrents, and the sagebrush burst into a pungent, silver-green life that scented the air for miles. Maggie O'Rourke ceased to be merely a guest in her own home. She became a student of survival. Her education was not formal. It was written in the ache of her muscles and the dirt ingrained in her skin. She learned that a horse was not a carriage animal, but a partner with a mind of its own. Eli gave her a mare, a steady bay named Bess with a white star on her forehead and a forgiving temperament. The first time Maggie mounted her, gripping the saddle horn until her knuckles turned white, she felt terrifyingly high off the ground. The horizon seemed to tilt. "Relax your spine," Eli had called out from the corral fence, his voice carrying over the wind. "You are fighting her. Move with the animal, not against her." It took 10 days of bruising rides, of sore thighs that made walking a misery, before Maggie felt the rhythm. But when she finally caught it, the moment her body learned to anticipate the mare's stride, she felt a surge of triumph that was sharper than any joy she had known in the city. She rode out to the south pasture to check the fence line, the wind tearing at her bonnet, and for the first time, she did not feel like an intruder on the land. She felt like a part of it. She learned the brutal art of branding. The smell of singed hair and burnt hide sickened her at first, turning her stomach until she had to retch behind the wagon. But she wiped her mouth, drank a ladle of warm water from the barrel, and went back to the fire. She learned to keep the irons hot, to move quickly so the calf suffered less, to ignore the bawling of the mothers. She learned to read the sky. The clouds here were not just decoration. They were warnings. High, wispy mare's tails meant wind was coming. Low, flat banks of gray meant snow or rain, depending on the bite in the air. A greenish tint to the west meant hail that could strip a garden bare in 5 minutes. The land was still vast, still terrifying in its indifference. When she stood on the porch at night, the silence was so profound it felt like a weight pressing against her eardrums. But she was beginning to understand the language of this place. She was no longer deaf to it. The town of Bitter Creek, however, was harder to read than the sky. They went in on the first Saturday of the month for supplies. Maggie sat straight on the wagon seat, wearing a dress she had turned and mended until it looked respectable, her hair pulled back in a severe, neat bun. As they walked the boardwalk, she felt the shift in the air. It was subtle. Mr. Henderson at the Mercantile nodded to her with a genuine smile this time. He had heard from Gus that the new Mrs. Mercer was a worker, that she had patched the canvas covering on the chuck wagon better than a sailmaker. In this country, competence bought a measure of forgiveness. "Morning, Mrs. Mercer," Henderson said, weighing out their coffee. "Heard you managed to save the early beans from the frost. That is good work. I used burlap sacks and straw." "Mr. Henderson," Maggie replied, her voice steady. It seemed a waste to let the cold take them. A woman standing nearby, the wife of a sodbuster from the North Valley, gave Maggie a shy, tentative nod. She looked tired, her hands as rough as Maggie's, and in her eyes, Maggie saw a flicker of solidarity. They were both women trying to coax life out of hostile soil, but the kindness was not universal. As they exited the store, a group of men were gathered near the saloon. They were playing cards on a barrel, laughing loudly. When Maggie passed, the laughter cut off abruptly, replaced by a low murmuring. "That is the one." A voice drifted over the dusty street. "Fancy piece from the city. Bought with heifer money." Another voice snickered. "Heard she used to work the high streets. You can tell by the walk." Maggie stiffened. Her hand tightened on Eli's arm. She felt his bicep turn to stone under his coat. He stopped, beginning to turn toward the men, his face darkening with a rage that terrified her. "Eli, no," she whispered urgently, pulling on his sleeve. "Please, do not. It is not worth it." He looked down at her, his jaw working. They have no right. They have tongues, she said, forcing herself to keep walking. Let them wag. If we stop, we give them power. Eli hesitated, glaring at the men until they looked away, shuffling their cards with sudden interest. Then he allowed her to lead him back to the wagon. But the poison was there. It was in the way the pastor's wife crossed the street to avoid them. It was in the way the bank teller looked at her dress, as if searching for a stain that would prove the rumors true. The whispers had a source, and that source arrived at the Mercer Ranch 2 weeks later in a shiny black buggy with red wheels. Silas Crane was a man who looked too clean for Wyoming. His suit was a dark, expensive broadcloth that seemed to repel dust. His boots were polished to a mirror's shine. He was a handsome man in a sharp, predatory way, with silvering hair and a smile that showed too many teeth. He did not come to the house. He drove his buggy right up to the barn where Eli and Maggie were sorting tools. "Eli Mercer," Silas called out, remaining in his seat. He held the reins with gloved hands. Eli stepped out of the barn, wiping grease from his hands on a rag. His limp was heavy today. "Silas," he said, "to what do I owe the honor?" "Business, Eli, always business." Silas's eyes drifted past Eli and landed on Maggie, who was standing in the shadows of the barn door. His gaze was physical, a slow, crawling inspection that made Maggie feel as though she were standing naked in the snow. "And this must be the lady," Silas said, his voice smooth as oil. "Mrs. Mercer. Or do you prefer Maggie?" "Mrs. Mercer is fine," Maggie said, stepping forward into the light. She would not hide in the dark. Silas chuckled. "A spirited one. I like that. I heard you hail from New York, Mrs. Mercer. A very different world from our dusty little corner. I spent some time in the city myself, the theater district, the nightlife." He let the word hang there, heavy with implication. He was telling her he knew. He was telling her that he recognized the look of a woman who had been desperate. Maggie met his gaze. Her heart was hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird, but her face was a mask of calm. "I found the city crowded. Mr. Crane, I prefer the open air." Silas smiled, but his eyes were cold. "Indeed, though the open air can be dangerous for those who do not know their place." He turned his attention back to Eli, dismissing her as if she were a servant. "We need to talk. Eli, privately." Eli looked at Maggie, then back at Silas. "Go inside." "Maggie." She hesitated, wanting to stay, wanting to protect Eli from this snake, but the look in Eli's eyes was pleading. She turned and walked to the house, her back straight, feeling Silas's eyes boring into her spine every step of the way. She did not go inside. She went to the side of the house, near the open window of the parlor where Eli led Silas. She pressed her back against the rough logs and listened. "I am running out of patience." "Eli," Silas's voice came through the window, stripped of its social pleasantries. "You are 3 months behind on the note for the south section. I paid you what I had after the sale." Eli's voice was low, tight. "You know the winter was hard. The herd is thin." "The herd is thin because you manage it poorly," Silas countered. "And now you are spending money on mail-order luxuries. That is none of your concern. It is my concern when my collateral is being wasted. And there is the matter of the water rights. The creek that runs through your north pasture. I want access for my upper herd. That creek is the only water for 20 miles in that section," Eli said, his voice rising. "If I give you access, your cattle will muddy it to sludge. My stock will die. Then sell, Eli. Sell me the ranch. I will give you a fair price. You can take your little bride and go somewhere easier. California, perhaps. Somewhere people do not know about. Her history." There was a silence, a long, vibrating silence. "What did you say?" Eli asked, his voice deadly quiet. "Come now." Silas laughed softly. "I have friends in New York. A woman alone, no family, fleeing the city. Rumors follow trains. Eli, they say she came from the gutter. They say she is a public woman." "A man like you, a deacon of the church." "It does not look good. If the bank were to foreclose, the moral character of the borrower might be taken into account." "Get out," Eli snarled. Silas made a tisking sound. Emotional, as always. Think about it. Eli, the water rights, or the ranch. Or I start asking louder questions about what kind of house Mrs. Mercer lived in before she came here. Maggie heard the sound of boots, the door opening, and then Silas's buggy rattling away. She slid down the wall, burying her face in her knees. He knew. He didn't just suspect. He knew how to twist the knife. She was the weakness. She was the weapon Silas would use to destroy Eli. That evening, the sky turned a bruised purple over the western hills. The wind had died down, leaving a silence that felt heavy with unsaid words. Eli had been working on the fence since Silas left, driving staples into cedar posts with a violence that frightened the horses. He had not spoken to her. He had not looked at her. Maggie walked out to the barn. She found him not working, but standing near the back doors, staring out at the darkening land. The gap in the boards framed a slice of the prairie, miles of gray sage, the distant specks of cattle, and the overwhelming, crushing vastness of the sky. He looked small against it. His shoulders were slumped, the tension finally bleeding out of him to leave only exhaustion. Maggie stepped up beside him. She did not touch him. She simply stood there, looking out at the same emptiness. "It is beautiful," she said softly. "And terrible." Eli let out a long breath. "Silas wants the water. Maggie, he wants to bleed us dry. And he is using you to do it. I heard," she said. Eli turned to look at her, his face stricken. "You heard? I listened at the window. I am sorry." He ran a hand over his face, rubbing his eyes. "I should have protected you better. I should have sent you away the day you arrived. This place, it destroys soft things. And now he will drag your name through the mud to get to me." He turned back to the window, gripping the frame. "Maybe he is right. Maybe we should sell. I could get you a ticket to San Francisco. You could start over where no one knows." Maggie looked at his back. She saw the defeat there. He was trying to save her by sending her away. He thought she was fragile. He thought she was a victim who needed to be hidden. She looked out at the horizon. The first stars were piercing the violet sky. It went on forever. It was a land that demanded everything you had, and if you held anything back, it killed you. It's too big. She whispered. Eli froze. His heart hammered a painful rhythm against his ribs. There it was, the admission. She was breaking. It was too big, too hard, too cruel. She was going to leave him. The thought tore through him with a violence that shocked him. He had told himself he didn't need her, that she was just a partner. But the idea of the house without her quiet presence was suddenly unbearable. He turned slowly, bracing himself. "I know," he said hoarsely. "I know it is. You don't have to stay. Maggie, I won't hold you to a promise made in ignorance." Maggie turned to face him. Her eyes were not filled with tears. They were filled with a fierce, burning light he had never seen before. "No, Eli, that is not what I mean." She took a step closer to him. "I mean the life," she said, her voice gaining strength. "The work, the danger. It is too big for one man to carry. You are trying to carry it all, the debt, the ranch, the guilt, me. You are trying to stand between me and the world like I am a glass doll. I am your husband," Eli said. "It is my duty. Duty be damned," she snapped. Eli blinked, stunned. "I do not need a protector. Eli, I had a protector in New York. He protected me right into a living hell." She took a breath, her hands clenching into fists at her sides. "I need a partner, a real one." She reached out and took his arm, her fingers digging into his sleeve. "Teach me, Eli. Don't just give me chores to keep me busy. Teach me the accounts. Show me where Silas is cheating us. Teach me how to shoot so I don't have to hide in the house when a stranger rides up. Teach me the water rights." "Maggie, it is dangerous." "I know," she cried. "It is all dangerous. Living is dangerous. But if I am to stay here, if I am to be your wife, do not leave me small in a life this big. I want to share the risk. I want to share the fight. I want to be equal to this land." Eli stared at her. The silence of the barn stretched out, but it was no longer empty. It was filled with the echo of her demand. He looked at her face, the sharp chin, the determined mouth. The eyes that had seen horror and refused to look away. Something inside his chest, a tight, cold knot that had been there since the blizzard, began to loosen. He had spent years mourning the woman he couldn't save. He had been so busy guarding his grief that he hadn't realized a warrior had walked into his life. She didn't want his pity. She wanted his respect. She wanted to stand shoulder to shoulder with him against the wind. He let out a breath he felt like he had been holding for 5 years. "You mean it," he said softly. "You really mean it. I have never meant anything more." Eli stepped closer. The space between them, usually a carefully maintained buffer zone, collapsed. He raised his hand, his fingers trembling slightly, and brushed a loose strand of auburn hair from her cheek. His knuckles grazed her skin. It was electric. "You are stronger than I am, Maggie O'Rourke," he murmured. "No," she whispered, leaning into his touch, her eyes fluttering shut. "I am just tired of being afraid." The air in the barn shifted. The smell of hay and leather faded, replaced by the overwhelming awareness of each other. Eli looked at her mouth. It was trembling, the desire that he had been stamping down, burying under work and exhaustion, rose up like a floodwater. He lowered his head. She did not pull away. She rose on her tiptoes to meet him. The kiss was not like the stories. It was not soft. It was desperate. It was the collision of two lonely, starving people who had found sustenance in a desert. Eli's arms went around her, pulling her crushed against his chest. Maggie's hands found the back of his neck, her fingers tangling in his hair, pulling him closer. He tasted of coffee and tobacco. She tasted of something sweet and wild. He groaned low in his throat, a sound of surrender, and deepened the kiss, his mouth moving over hers with a hunger that shook them both. For a moment, the ranch, the debt, Silas Crane, it all vanished. There was only the heat of their bodies and the frantic beating of their hearts. They broke apart, gasping for air. Eli kept his hands on her waist, his forehead resting against hers. His breathing was ragged. He could feel every curve of her body against his, and every instinct he had was screaming at him to lift her up, to carry her to the hayloft, to claim this connection completely. But he stopped. He pulled back, his hands sliding down her arms to hold her hands. He looked at her, his eyes dark and dilated, but filled with a painful restraint. "Maggie," he rasped. We cannot, not like this." Maggie looked at him, her lips swollen, her chest heaving. "Why?" "Because you deserve to be courted," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You deserve to be more than a comfort in the dark, and out of respect, for who you are, for who I'm trying to be again." He squeezed her hands. "If we do this, if we truly come together, I want it to be because we are ready, because the past is settled, not because we are afraid of the dark." Maggie felt a pang of disappointment, a physical ache of unfulfilled need, but beneath it, a warm current of gratitude. He was treating her with honor. He was giving her agency. "You are a stubborn man, Eli Mercer," she whispered, a shaky smile touching her lips. "I am," he admitted, thumbing a tear from under her eye. "But I am your partner. If that is what you want, it is what I want." "Then tomorrow," he said, straightening up and letting her hands go with visible reluctance. "Tomorrow we open the books, and I will teach you how to use the Colt." Maggie nodded. "Tomorrow." They walked back to the house in the dark, not touching, but the air between them was no longer cold. It was charged, humming with a promise that was both terrifying and beautiful. The next morning, the education of Maggie Mercer began in earnest. They sat at the kitchen table, the heavy ledger spread open between them. Eli explained the columns of figures, the price of feed, the loans Silas held, the meager profits from the last drive. Maggie listened, her brow furrowed, her finger tracing the lines. "Here," she said, pointing to a recent entry. "This interest calculation. It is wrong." Eli looked. "It is what the bank statement said. It is wrong," she insisted. "The rate is 6%, but this charge is calculated at 8. See, he is compounding it monthly, not yearly. The contract says yearly." Eli stared at the numbers. He grabbed a piece of slate and did the math. She was right. Silas had been skimming off the top, adding phantom weight to the debt for months. He slammed his hand on the table. The thief. Maggie looked at him, her eyes hard. We will catch him. Eli, we will document every penny. And when he comes back, we will be ready. That afternoon, they went behind the barn. Eli carried his heavy Colt Navy revolver and a box of cartridges. He set up tin cans on a fence post 20 yards away. It kicks, he warned her. Hold it with both hands. Maggie took the gun. It was heavy, cold steel that smelled of oil. She raised it, her arms shaking slightly. Eli stepped up behind her. He did not touch her at first. Stand with your feet apart. Good. Now, lean into it. He reached around her to adjust her grip. His chest pressed against her back. Maggie's breath hitched. She could feel the solid wall of his body, the heat radiating through his shirt. His arms were around her, his hands covering hers on the grip of the gun. It was an embrace disguised as a lesson. Relax your shoulders, he murmured, his mouth close to her ear. His breath ghosted over the sensitive skin of her neck, sending a shiver down her spine. I am trying, she stammered. Breathe, Maggie. Don't hold it. Squeeze the trigger. Don't pull, like you are threading a needle. Smooth. She focused on the can. She tried to ignore the pounding of her heart, the overwhelming sensory overload of having him this close. She focused on the front sight. She exhaled. She squeezed. The gun roared, bucking in her hands. The can on the far right spun off the post, a jagged hole through its center. I hit it, she shouted, turning to look at him. She found his face inches from hers. He was not looking at the can. He was looking at her, his eyes dark with that same simmering heat from the barn. You have a good eye, he said softly. They stood there, the gun smoking in her hands, the echo of the shot fading into the hills. The line between survival and desire was blurring, erasing itself with every lesson, every glance, every moment of shared defiance. I want to try again, she said, her voice dropping. Eli nodded, but he didn't step back. He stayed right there, wrapping his arms around her again, steadying her aim and anchoring her to the earth. Again, he whispered. And as she took aim, Maggie knew she wasn't just learning to shoot. She was learning that she was dangerous, she was capable, and for the first time in her life, she was not alone. The world was still too big. Yes, but she was growing to match it. The war for the Mercer Ranch did not begin with a roar of cannons, but with the quiet, metallic snip of wire cutters in the dark. It was a slow strangulation. At first, it was just a few stray calves found wandering on Silas Crane's land, branded with the Mercer M, but claimed by Crane's foreman as mavericks, found on open range. Then it was the water, the creek that fed the north pasture. The lifeline for the herd during the dry season began to run suspiciously low. Eli rode upstream and found a newly built dam on Crane's property, diverting the flow. When he tore it down with his bare hands and a crowbar, he found it rebuilt 2 days later, guarded by men with Winchesters resting across their saddles. Silas Crane did not hide his hand. He simply dared Eli to bite it. Maggie learned to sleep with one ear open. The silence of the Wyoming night, once terrifying, was now a canvas on which she painted her fears. Every snap of a twig, every hoot of an owl sounded like an intruder. She and Eli took turns keeping watch from the porch, a rifle resting on the railing, a pot of black coffee between them. They did not speak much during those long watches. They did not have to. The partnership she had demanded in the barn had forged a steel link between them. When Eli's leg ached from the damp, Maggie would quietly rub a liniment of arnica and turpentine into the muscle, her hands strong and sure. When Maggie's eyes grew heavy, Eli would drape his coat over her shoulders and tell her to close her eyes for an hour. But vigilance was not enough against a man who owned the law. Silas rode out on a Tuesday, flanked by the sheriff, a man named Brady, who had a pot-belly and eyes that shifted like sand in a windstorm. Mr. Crane has raised a concern, Sheriff Brady said, not stepping down from his horse. He says you threatened his men at the creek, says you waved a weapon and spoke of violence. I tore down an illegal dam. Eli said, his voice level. "That water belongs to the valley, not to Crane's private stock. That is for the courts to decide," Silas said smoothly, flicking a speck of dust from his cuff. "In the meantime, Sheriff, I believe there are laws about public morality that we should discuss." Silas turned his gaze to Maggie, who stood on the porch, her hand gripping the railing. "We have decent families in this valley," Silas continued, his voice dripping with false concern. "We cannot have questionable influences putting down roots. Vagrancy laws are quite strict about women without clear means of support or a respectable background. If the ranch were to face foreclosure, for instance, Mrs. Mercer might find herself in a very precarious legal position. It was a threat, naked and ugly. He was telling Eli that if he lost the land, he would lose Maggie too, to a jail cell or a train back east. "Get off my land," Eli said. The colt on his hip was heavy, a promise of violence that hummed in the air. "We are leaving," Silas said, touching the brim of his hat to Maggie. "A pleasant day to you, Mrs. Mercer. Do try to stay out of trouble." 3 nights later, the sky to the east turned a sickly, pulsating orange. It was the homestead of the Svenssons, a young couple who had settled 3 miles down the basin. By the time Eli and the hands rode out, the roof had already collapsed. Maggie followed in the buckboard with water barrels, but it was useless. They stood helplessly as the timber frame turned to ash, the heat searing their faces. The Svenssons huddled in the dirt, shivering in their nightclothes, watching their life disappear. It was a lantern. "Mrs. Svensson sobbed, clutching her children. The cow kicked it over. But in the smoky aftermath, as the townsfolk gathered to stare at the ruins, the whispers began. Men muttered that Eli's steers had been seen near the barn right before the blaze, spooking the milk cow. Others looked toward the road where Silas Crane's carriage sat watching, but they looked away quickly, fear sealing their lips. The smell of smoke hung over the valley for days. It seeped into the curtains, into the bedding, into the very pores of their skin. It was the scent of a warning. Then came the night the world broke apart. It was a moonless night, the air heavy with static. The herd was restless, lowing and shifting in the home pasture. Eli was in the barn, checking the hooves of his gelding. Maggie was in the kitchen, banking the stove. The first sound was not a gunshot, but a rumble, a deep, vibrating thrum that came up through the soles of their feet. Then came the crack of pistol fire, sharp and rhythmic, coming from the ridge above the house. Stampede. Gus yelled from the bunkhouse. Maggie ran to the porch. The darkness was alive. The herd, 200 head of terrified muscle and horn, was pouring down the slope, driven by riders firing into the air. They were heading straight for the fencing, straight for the structures. "Eli!" she screamed. He was already moving, mounting his horse bareback in the corral, shouting for the men. Turn them west, or they will hit the house." Dust choked the air, thick and blinding. The sound was deafening, the thunder of 800 hooves, the bawling of calves, the shouting of men. Maggie grabbed a lantern and ran toward the gate, waving the light, trying to spook the leaders away from the garden fence. Out of the swirling grit, a rider appeared, not one of theirs. He held a torch. He didn't throw it at the cattle. He threw it onto the porch of the ranch house. The dry wood, cured by years of wind and sun, caught instantly. Maggie screamed, torn between the cattle and the fire. She ran back, grabbing a bucket of water from the trough, throwing it on the flames that were licking up the support pillars. The fire roared, eating into the parlor wall, shattering the window glass with the heat. In the pasture, the chaos turned tragic. Billy, the young ranch hand who had only just started to fill out his frame, rode hard to cut off the lead steer. His horse stumbled in a gopher hole. There was no time to scream. The horse went down, and the wave of cattle rolled over them. "Billy!" Eli roared. He spurred his horse into the mass, firing his gun into the ground to split the herd. He reached the boy, leaping from his horse to shield the broken body with his own, the hooves pounding inches from his head. The stampede broke, the cattle scattering into the dark. leaving behind a silence that was louder than the noise had been. The fire on the porch hissed and died as Gus and the other hands doused it with wet blankets and dirt. But the damage was done. The parlor was a blackened, gaping maw. The front of the house looked like a skull with the teeth kicked out, but the house could be fixed. Eli knelt in the dirt of the pasture, his shirt torn, his face masked in dust and blood. Billy lay still. His neck was broken. He looked very young, his eyes wide and staring at the smoke-choked stars. Eli gathered the boy into his arms. He rocked him, a low, guttural sound tearing from his throat. It was the sound of a man who had reached his limit. They carried Billy to the bunkhouse. Maggie washed the boy's face, her own tears making tracks in the soot on her cheeks. Eli stood in the doorway, his hand gripping the frame so hard the wood splintered. "This is murder," Eli whispered. Before dawn, the sheriff returned. He did not come alone. He brought 4 deputies with shotguns. "Eli Mercer," Sheriff Brady said, stepping over the charred debris on the porch. "You are under arrest." "For what?" Maggie cried, stepping between Eli and the lawmen. "For being attacked, for losing a man, for criminal negligence resulting in death," Brady recited, avoiding her eyes, "and for making terroristic threats against Mr. Crane. We have a witness who says you swore to burn this valley down if you couldn't have your way. Seems you started with your own place to cover your tracks." It was a lie so bold it took the breath from her lungs. They handcuffed Eli. He did not fight. He looked at Maggie, his eyes burning with a desperate, terrifying intensity. "Stay in the house," he told her. "Keep the gun close. Do not open the door for anyone but Gus. I will get the judge," she promised, her voice shaking. "I will ride to Cheyenne if I have to." They dragged him away, throwing him into the back of a wagon like a sack of grain. Maggie stood on the blackened porch, watching the dust settle, leaving her alone with a dead boy in the bunkhouse and a house that smelled of char and ruin. The day passed in a blur of grief and terror. Gus and the remaining hands dug a grave for Billy on the hill. They worked in silence, their faces grim. They were frightened. They knew that if Eli could be taken, none of them were safe. At dusk, a buggy arrived. Maggie was in the parlor, sweeping up the shattered glass and ash. The wall was scorched black, the wallpaper peeling away in crispy strips. The room smelled of wet ash and disaster. She heard the boots on the floorboards and gripped the broom handle like a staff. Silas Crane stood in the doorway. He looked around the ruined room, a look of distaste curling his lip. A terrible tragedy. He said, "Get out," Maggie said. Her voice was low, vibrating with a hatred she had never felt before. "I'm here to help. Maggie. May I call you Maggie? It seems appropriate, given the circumstances." He stepped into the room, kicking a piece of burnt wood aside. "I can make this go away," he said softly. "The charges, the debts, all of it. Sheriff Brady listens to reason, and I am a very reasonable man." Maggie watched him. She saw the hunger in his eyes. It wasn't just land hunger. It was the same look she had seen on the face of the landlord in New York. The look of a man who sees a woman not as a person, but as a heavily discounted asset. "And what is the price?" she asked. Silas smiled. He walked toward her, slow and deliberate. "You are a practical woman. You survived the city. You know how the world works. Eli is finished. He will rot in that cell, or hang for negligence. You are alone. You have no money, no family, and a reputation that is, let us say, fragile." He stopped inches from her. He smelled of bay rum and expensive cigars, a cloying scent that made her stomach turn. "Sign the deed over to me," he said. "Declare the marriage void. Fraud. Perhaps. Come to town. I have a large house. I have need of a housekeeper, someone with your specific talents." The implication hung in the air, gross and suffocating. He was offering her the position of a kept woman, a mistress in a gilded cage, paid for with her husband's life. Maggie dropped the broom. Silas's smile widened, thinking she was yielding. She stepped back, her heel hitting a charred support beam. Silas moved in, pressing her against the black wood. He raised a hand. his thumb tracing the line of her jaw, his grip tightening until it was painful. "Do not play the innocent. Maggie, we both know what you are. I am offering you a soft landing." The touch of his hand on her skin snapped something inside her. The fear evaporated, replaced by a cold, white-hot fury. She brought her knee up, driving it hard into his groin. Silas doubled over with a wheezing gasp. As his head came down, Maggie raked her fingernails across his face, digging deep, drawing 4 lines of bright red blood across his cheek. She shoved him backward. He stumbled over the debris and fell into a pile of wet ash, ruining his fine suit. "I would rather die in the dirt," she hissed, standing over him, looking like a vengeful fury in the gloom. "I would rather starve on this land than let a man like you touch me again." Silas scrambled up, clutching his face, his eyes wide with shock and rage. He touched his cheek, looking at the blood on his fingers. "You will regret that," he snarled, his voice losing its smooth polish. "You will beg me. I will see you in the gutter where you belong." "Get out," she screamed, grabbing the heavy iron poker from the fireplace. He fled. He scrambled out of the house and into his buggy, whipping the horse into a frenzy. Maggie stood in the ruin of her home, the poker shaking in her hand. The adrenaline crashed, leaving her trembling. She sank to the floor, the soot staining her dress, and let out a sob that tore at her throat. She was alone. Eli was gone. The house was broken. She sat there as the darkness gathered, feeling the weight of the sky pressing down on the roof. 2 hours later, she heard horses again. Many horses. She scrambled up, gripping the poker, expecting Silas's men to come and finish the job. But it was Deputy Miller, a young man with a kind face who had always looked uncomfortable around the sheriff. And with him was Eli. Eli was handcuffed, his face gray with exhaustion, but he was alive. 5 minutes. "Mrs. Mercer," the deputy said, looking nervously at the road. "The sheriff is drinking at the saloon. I told him I had to bring the prisoner back to collect his medication for his leg. If he finds out." "Thank you," Maggie whispered. They went into the barn. The house was too open, too scarred. The barn was their place. It smelled of hay and animals, a living, breathing warmth. The deputy waited outside. Eli looked at her. He saw the soot on her face, the tear in her dress, the wildness in her eyes. "Did he hurt you?" Eli asked, his voice a dangerous rumble. "He tried," she said. "I hurt him back." Eli let out a ragged breath. He raised his cuffed hands, reaching for her. Maggie stepped into the circle of his arms, burying her face in his neck. They clung to each other. It was not a hug. It was a collision. They held on with the desperation of people watching the water rise around them. "I am sorry," Eli whispered into her hair. "I am so sorry. I dragged you into this fire. No." She pulled back, framing his face with her hands, smearing soot on his cheeks. "We are in the fire together. You are not leaving me, Eli Mercer. Do you hear me? You are not leaving me. I don't know if I can stop them. Maggie, they have the judge, the law. Then we will fight them," she said fiercely. "But right now I need you to know." "Know what? That I am yours. Not because of a paper, not because of the ranch. Because I choose you." She kissed him. It was a kiss that tasted of salt and ash and terror. It was a kiss that burned. Eli groaned, a sound of surrender. He pressed her back against the ladder of the hayloft. The handcuffs clinked, a sharp metallic sound that underscored the fragility of the moment. He couldn't use his hands freely, so she used hers. She pulled his shirt open, her palms flat against his chest, feeling the heavy, frantic beat of his heart. They sank down onto the pile of fresh hay. There was no coyness, no hesitation. The shadow of the jail cell, the shadow of Silas, the shadow of death, it all stripped away the pretense. They needed this. They needed to affirm life in the face of so much destruction. Eli kissed her throat, her shoulder, his face rough with stubble. Maggie held him, arching into his touch, claiming him with every breath. It was a fierce, frantic joining. It was an act of defiance. By loving each other, here in the dirt and the dark, they were proving that Silas owned nothing that mattered. He could burn the house, he could steal the cattle, but he could not touch this. The barn was filled with the sounds of their breathing, the rustle of straw, the low, desperate murmurs of a name spoken like prayers. Later, they lay tangled in the horse blankets. The barn quiet again save for the shifting of the animals. Eli's head rested on her shoulder. The handcuffs were still on his wrists. A cruel reminder. "You have to go to the federal judge," Maggie whispered, her fingers tracing the scar on his eyebrow. "In Laramie or Cheyenne. I can't leave you here alone. I can ride. Eli, you taught me. Bess is fast. I will find a way." Eli turned his head, kissing her palm. "I love you. Maggie O'Rourke, I love you. Eli Mercer." The door creaked open. "Time's up. Eli," the deputy's voice called softly, filled with regret. They stood up. They fixed their clothes with trembling hands. Eli looked at her one last time, memorizing her face in the lantern light, the strength in her jaw, the softness of her mouth, the fire in her eyes. He walked to the door, his head high. He did not look like a prisoner. He looked like a man who had something worth dying for. Maggie watched the wagon fade into the night, the red tail light bobbing like a bloody eye. She stood in the doorway of the barn, the cold wind drying the tears on her face. She went back to the house, to the burnt parlor. She picked up the iron poker she had dropped. She sat in the chair facing the door, the metal heavy in her lap. She would not sleep. She would wait for dawn, and then she would ride. The world was trying to crush them, but as she looked at the ring on her finger, glimmering in the moonlight, she knew one thing for certain. It would have to kill them to stop them. The morning after Eli was taken, the silence on the Mercer ranch was a physical weight. It pressed against the burnt timbers of the porch and settled heavy in the dust of the yard. The ranch hands moved like ghosts, speaking in low murmurs, their eyes constantly scanning the ridge for Silas Crane's riders. Maggie did not sleep. She sat in the kitchen, the heavy Colt revolver on the table beside a cup of cold coffee. She was not waiting for rescue. She was waiting for an opening. It came in the form of a rattletrap wagon driven by an old peddler named Jeremiah, a man who sold tin pots and gossip from the Dakota Territory to the Utah border. He watered his mules at their trough, oblivious to the tension until Gus explained the situation in hushed tones. Jeremiah spat tobacco juice into the dirt and looked at Maggie, who stood on the steps with her arms crossed. "There is a judge," Jeremiah rasped, wiping his mouth with a stained sleeve. "Judge Thaddeus Blackwood. He is holding circuit court in Granite Peak. That is 3 days' hard ride south. He is a federal man. Does not answer to local cattle barons or crooked sheriffs. He hangs horse thieves and bankers with equal enthusiasm." 3 days, Maggie repeated. "Through the Badlands," Jeremiah warned. "No water, plenty of rattlesnakes. And if Crane finds out you are gone, he will send wolves after you." Maggie looked at the south horizon. It was a jagged line of gray rock and heat haze. It looked like the mouth of hell. "Thank you, Jeremiah," she said. She packed her saddlebags within the hour. Dried beef, a canteen, a jar of salve, and the box of cartridges Eli had taught her to use. Gus tried to stop her, his weathered face twisted with worry. "Mrs. Mercer, you cannot go alone. Let me send Dutch. If you send a man, Silas will notice the ranch is short-handed," Maggie argued, tightening the cinch on Bess. "He is watching you. He expects me to be a weeping widow in the house. He will not look for me on the trail until it is too late." She mounted the mare. She wore a split riding skirt she had fashioned herself and one of Eli's heavy coats. She looked down at Gus. "If I am not back in a week, tell Eli. Tell him I tried." She turned Bess toward the south and kicked her into a gallop, leaving the only home she had ever known for a wilderness that promised nothing but danger. The land changed as she rode. The rolling sagebrush plains gave way to a broken, skeletal landscape of sandstone and shale. The wind here did not blow. It hissed through cracks in the rock. The sun beat down with a hammer's force, baking the moisture from the air until every breath felt like inhaling dust. Maggie rode with her hat pulled low, her eyes squinting against the glare. Her body ached with a deep, bruising fatigue. Every jolt of the horse sent a spike of pain through her spine. But she did not stop. She thought of Eli in that cell. She thought of his hands, rough and gentle, banding the bird's wing. She thought of the way he looked at her in the barn, not as a broken thing, but as a woman whole and terrifyingly dear. That memory was the water that kept her going when her canteen ran low. By the second day, the isolation began to play tricks on her mind. The heat waves shimmering off the rocks looked like riders. The wind sounded like voices. She navigated narrow gullies where the walls rose up like prison bars, red and imposing. She crossed flats where the earth was cracked into a mosaic of parched mud, miles of nothingness where a thrown shoe would mean death. She was 10 miles from Granite Peak, navigating a narrow pass known as Devil's Throat. When the shot rang out, it cracked against the stone wall inches from her head, sending a spray of rock slivers into her cheek. Bess reared, screaming. Maggie fought the reins, keeping her seat by instinct and sheer terror. She saw them then, 2 riders on the ridge above, silhouetted against the blinding sky. They were not bandits. She recognized the horse of the lead man. It was a roan with a white stocking. It belonged to one of Silas Crane's hired enforcers, a man named Cobb. "Bring her down," Cobb shouted, racking the lever of his rifle. "Don't kill the horse!" Maggie didn't think. She reacted. She spurred Bess forward, driving her into the chaotic tumble of boulders at the base of the cliff. Another bullet kicked up dirt near the mare's hooves. She slid from the saddle, grabbing the heavy coat from the holster. She slapped Bess on the rump, sending the horse scrambling down the draw. Away from the fire, Maggie threw herself behind a slab of fallen sandstone. Her breath came in shallow, jagged gasps. She was cornered. She was a seamstress from New York with a gun she had fired 3 times in her life, pinned down by men who killed for a monthly wage. "Come out, Mrs. Mercer!" Cobb's voice echoed off the canyon walls. "Mr. Crane just wants to talk. He is worried about your safety out here all alone." Laughter followed. Cruel, mocking laughter. Maggie rested the heavy barrel of the Colt on the rock. Her hands were shaking so hard the front sight blurred. "Breathe," she heard Eli's voice in her head. "Squeeze, don't pull," like threading a needle. She saw movement on the ridge. Cobb was descending, picking his way down the slope, careless because he thought he was hunting a rabbit. Maggie gritted her teeth. She was not a rabbit. She was a survivor of the tenements. She was the wife of Eli Mercer. She cocked the hammer. The sound was loud in the quiet heat. She waited. Cobb stepped out from behind a scrub cedar. She squeezed. The gun bucked violently, the recoil jarring her shoulder. The shot went wide, hitting the dirt 3 feet to his left. Cobb laughed, raising his rifle. "That was close, little lady. Now put it down before I—" She fired again. This time, she didn't close her eyes. This time, she saw the puff of dust on his vest, saw him jerk backward as if kicked by a mule. He dropped his rifle, clutching his shoulder, and stumbled, falling hard onto the scree. His partner on the ridge roared a curse and opened fire. Bullets chipped away at Maggie's cover, the stone turning to powder around her face. She scrambled backward, staying low, crawling through the brush. A sharp, stinging burn seared across her upper arm. She didn't look. She knew she had been hit. She scrambled down a wash, sliding on loose shale, her vision tunneling. She found Bess waiting in a cluster of juniper, the horse trembling. Maggie dragged herself into the saddle, her left arm hanging useless and wet with blood. "Go, Bess," she whispered, clutching the mane. "Run!" They ran until the sun went down, putting miles of broken country between them and the ambush. When the dark finally swallowed the land, Maggie slid from the horse near a dry creek bed. She stumbled, falling to her knees. Her sleeve was soaked with blood. Her head spun with a dizzying, sickening vertigo. She lay back in the dirt, looking up at the vast, uncaring stars. It was too big. The land was too big. She closed her eyes, and the dark took her. In the jail cell in Bitter Creek, Eli Mercer was pacing. He had paced for 2 days, a caged animal wearing a groove in the floorboards. Rumors had a way of slipping through iron bars. The deputy who brought his evening gruel had whispered it. His eyes averted. Your wife is gone, Eli. They say she rode south, and they say Crane sent Cobb and Lefty after her. The rage that filled Eli was cold and absolute. It was not the hot flash of a fight. It was the glacial certainty of a man who has nothing left to lose. That night, Deputy Miller sat at the desk, pretending to read a penny dreadful. The sheriff was across the street at the saloon, drinking away the guilt of being a bought man. There was a tap at the back window. Miller stiffened, then slowly stood up. He walked to the cell block door. "I am going to check the perimeter," he said to the empty room. He unlocked the back door and walked out, leaving the keys on the desk. A moment later, the back door opened again. It was Gus. He moved quietly for an old man. He picked up the keys. Eli stood at the bars, his hands gripping the cold iron. "Horse?" Eli asked. "Tethered in the alley," Gus whispered. "Unlocking the cell. Your rifle is in the scabbard. I brought the bay you like, and a fresh horse for her." Eli stepped out. He did not look back at the cell. He placed a hand on Gus's shoulder. "If I don't come back, the ranch is yours to manage. Keep the men paid. You bring her back. Eli, that is all that matters." Eli slipped out into the night. He rode out of town using the dry washes to hide his dust, heading south. He rode with a reckless speed, trusting the moon and the memory of the land. He knew where she would go. He knew the road to Granite Peak. He found the site of the ambush the next afternoon. He found the blood on the rocks. It was dried and black in the heat. His heart stopped. He touched the stone, his fingers trembling. It was a small smear. Too much for a scratch. Not enough for a kill. He saw the tracks, a horse running hard, a rider slumping. He tracked her for 10 miles. He found her at dusk. She was lying in the shadow of a limestone overhang, beside a trickle of water that wept from the rock. Bess was standing guard, her head low. Maggie was pale, her skin the color of old parchment. Her coat was matted with blood on the left side. "Maggie." He threw himself off his horse before it had fully stopped. He scrambled up the slope, falling to his knees beside her. She opened her eyes. They were glassy with fever, but they cleared when they saw him. "Eli?" she whispered. Her voice was a dry rustle, like leaves blowing over stone. "I am here," he choked out. He pulled her into his arms, mindful of her wound. He ripped the sleeve of her dress, exposing the furrow where the bullet had torn through the muscle. It was angry and red, but it had missed the bone. "You foolish, stubborn woman," he said, his voice thick with tears and fury. "You could have died. You rode into the Badlands alone. Why? Why would you do such a thing?" Maggie hissed as he poured water over the wound to clean it. She gripped his shirt with her good hand, pulling him closer. "Because you were in a cage," she said. Her teeth gritted against the pain. "Because I am your partner, and partners do not sit and wait for the end." Eli rested his forehead against hers. He was shaking. The terror of losing her, the sheer awe of her courage, it overwhelmed him. "I thought I had lost you. I saw the blood at the pass. I shot him." "Eli," she murmured, her eyes drifting shut. "I squeezed the trigger, just like you said. You did good, Maggie, you did good." He dressed her wound by the light of the moon, tearing his own shirt for bandages. He held her through the night as she shivered with the after effects of shock, his body acting as a shield against the wind. He did not sleep. He watched the horizon, his rifle across his lap, daring the world to come for her again. They reached Granite Peak 2 days later. Maggie rode tied to her saddle, upright only by sheer force of will. Eli led their horses, his eyes dark and hollowed by exhaustion. Judge Thaddeus Blackwood was a man carved from oak. He sat in the small office behind the feed store that served as his temporary courthouse, listening as Maggie O'Rourke Mercer told her story. She did not hide the shame. She stood before him, her arm in a sling, her face gaunt but her voice steady. She told him of the tenements. She told him of the sewing shop. She told him of the landlord who called himself a protector, and the sister who burned in a locked room because she owed money to men like Silas Crane. She told him of the ranch, of the cut fences, of the fires, of the threats to have her arrested for her past to leverage her husband's land. I have run from men like this my whole life. Judge, she said, her voice ringing in the small room. I ran until I found a place that was big enough to be free. I will not let a petty tyrant with a bank ledger take it from us. I will not be owned again. Then Eli stood. He spoke of his own failures. He admitted to the judge that he had been broken by grief, that he had neglected his duties, but that he had never threatened Silas Crane with anything but the truth. I am a man who made mistakes, Your Honor, Eli said, but I am not a criminal, and this woman is the bravest soul I have ever known. If you want justice, look at her scars. Judge Blackwood leaned back in his chair. He lit a pipe, the smoke curling around his gray whiskers. I have heard of Mr. Crane, the judge said. His reach is long, but the arm of the federal government is longer. He stood up. I will impanel a grand jury, and I will ride back to Bitter Creek with you. I believe it is time we brought some law to that valley. The return to Bitter Creek was a procession of judgment. Judge Blackwood brought 3 federal marshals, hard-eyed men with badges that shone dull silver in the sun. They arrived on a Sunday. The church bell was ringing. The hearing was held in the sanctuary, the only room big enough to hold the town. The pews were packed. The air was thick with the smell of sweat and fear. Silas Crane sat in the front row, his face a mask of polite confusion, though his eyes darted nervously to the marshals standing by the doors. Eli and Maggie sat at a small table near the altar. The cross on the wall hung above them, the same cross that had witnessed their silent, lonely wedding. Judge Blackwood took the pulpit. He did not need a gavel. His voice was command enough. This court is in session, he boomed. We are here to investigate charges of corruption, arson, and attempted murder. The testimony was a dam breaking. First came the peddler, Jeremiah, who testified he had seen Cobb and Lefty riding south on Crane's orders. Then came the widow Svensson. She walked up the aisle, her hands twisting her apron. She refused to look at Silas. He told my husband to sell, she whispered. He said if we didn't, the land would burn us out. 2 days later, the barn went up. Silas stood up, his face red. This is hearsay. This is a conspiracy of failures blaming a successful man for their own incompetence. Sit down, Mr. Crane, the judge ordered, or I will have you shackled. Then came the final blow. It was Shorty, the ranch hand who had mocked Maggie in the barn. He stood up from the back pew, twisting his hat in his hands. I saw the stampede, Shorty said, his voice shaking. I was riding fence on the North Ridge. I saw Crane's foreman, Lefty, drop the torch on the porch, and I saw him fire the shots that spooked the herd. A gasp went through the room. You are a liar, Silas screamed, turning to look at Shorty. You drunken fool. I fired you for incompetence. I am sober today. Mr. Crane, Shorty said, and I ain't going to hell for you. The judge looked at Silas. Silas Crane, you are under arrest for the murder of William Billy Miller and for conspiracy to commit arson. Marshals, take him. Silas backed away as the marshals advanced. His veneer of civilization cracked and fell away, revealing the cornered rat beneath. You cannot touch me. I own this town. I own the water. He reached into his coat. It happened in a heartbeat. The glint of nickel, the roar of a hidden derringer. Silas did not aim at the marshals. He aimed at the source of his ruin. He aimed at Eli. Maggie screamed. Eli shoved Maggie to the floor, covering her body with his own. The gun went off, a deafening crack in the enclosed space. A splinter of wood flew from the altar rail inches from Eli's head. Before Silas could cock the hammer again, a marshal's Winchester boomed. Silas Crane jerked. A red flower bloomed on the white front of his shirt. He looked down at it, an expression of profound surprise on his face. He looked at the town that had feared him, at the woman he had tried to buy, and at the man he couldn't break. He crumpled to the floor of the church, dead before he hit the planks. Silence filled the room. It was absolute. The dust motes danced in the shafts of light coming through the high windows. Eli slowly lifted his head. He checked Maggie. She was pale, shaking, but unharmed. "Are you hit?" he demanded, his hand searching her arms, her face. "No," she whispered. "No." They stood up together. The townspeople were staring, but the look had changed. The judgment was gone. In the eyes of the pastor's wife, in the eyes of the shopkeeper, in the eyes of the ranch hands. There was something new. There was respect. There was the recognition that they were looking at two people who had walked through the fire and come out holding hands. The judge stepped down from the pulpit. He looked at the body of Silas Crane, then at Eli and Maggie. "Justice is served," the judge said quietly. Though the cost was high, they walked out of the church into the blinding Wyoming sunlight. The wind was blowing, kicking up dust devils in the street. It was the same wind that had greeted Maggie when she arrived, hostile and relentless. But as she stood on the steps, her hand in Eli's, she didn't feel small anymore. She looked at the distant blue mountains, at the vast sweep of the plains. "It is over," Eli said, pulling her close. "No," Maggie corrected him, looking out at the land that was finally, truly theirs. "It is just beginning." The silence that followed the gunshot in the church was heavier than the shot itself. It was a silence that marked the end of an era in Bitter Creek, a sudden vacuum where fear used to be. Silas Crane lay on the pine floorboards, his ambition finally checked by a piece of lead, and the town he had ruled with a velvet-covered fist stared down at him in collective disbelief. Maggie stood up, brushing the dust from her skirt. She did not look at the body. She looked at Eli. He was pale, a smear of blood. Silas's or his own. She did not know. On his cheek, but he was standing like a man who had weathered a hurricane and found his feet on solid ground. The aftermath was a blur of official papers and hushed conversations. Judge Blackwood was efficient and unsentimental. He set up a temporary office in the back of the Mercantile and began the work of untangling Silas Crane's spiderweb of debts and fraudulent claims. The charges against Eli were dismissed with the stroke of a pen. The judge, peering over his spectacles, declared them to be a malicious fabrication. More importantly, he ordered an audit of the bank's ledgers. It was discovered that Silas had been inflating interest rates and fabricating penalties for years. When the math was corrected, the crushing debt that had hung over the Mercer Ranch for a decade shrank to a manageable sum. But the judge offered a warning as he handed Eli the restructuring papers. "Do not mistake this for a permanent victory. Mr. Mercer," Blackwood said, packing his pipe. "The law has visited this valley, but it does not live here. Men like Silas are weeds. You pull one, and another grows in the next rain. You keep your fences strong and your powder dry." Eli nodded, taking the papers. "We will be ready." "Judge." The town's reaction to Maggie was slower to shift. As they walked out of the Mercantile, the crowd parted. There were no jeers, no bold stares, but there was no embrace either. The pastor's wife, Mrs. Higgins, stopped them on the boardwalk. She looked at Maggie's arm, still in a sling, and then at her face. "I am sorry for your trouble, Mrs. Mercer," she said. The words were stiff, like new leather boots that hadn't been broken in. "We did not know. About the fires, about the threats. We survive." "Mrs. Higgins," Maggie said softly. "That is all anyone does out here." It was not forgiveness, and it was not friendship, but it was a truce. The ride back to the ranch was quiet. When they crested the final hill and looked down into the valley, the reality of what lay ahead hit them. The house was a scarred skull. The front porch was a pile of charcoal. The windows were gaping holes boarded up with scrap wood. The herd was scattered, and the fences were cut in a dozen places. It looked like a ruin. But as Eli pulled the horses to a stop, Maggie looked at it and felt a fierce, burning pride. It was burnt, yes, but it was standing. "We have work to do," Eli said, his voice heavy with fatigue. Maggie reached over and covered his hand with hers. Her fingers were rough now, calloused from the reins and the rope. But her touch was gentle. "Then let us get to work," she said. The rebuilding of the Mercer Ranch took the rest of the summer and well into the autumn. It was a season of blisters and backaches. Gus and the remaining hands worked from dawn until dusk, and Eli worked harder than any of them. He seemed driven by a need to erase the mark of Silas Crane from his land. They tore down the burnt porch and built a new one, wider and stronger, using cedar logs hauled down from the high country. They scraped the char from the logs of the main house and sealed them with fresh oil until the wood gleamed honey gold in the sun. They dug the well deeper, hitting a vein of water so cold and sweet it made Maggie's teeth ache. Maggie was not relegated to the kitchen. She worked alongside the men. She learned to mix mortar for the new chimney. She learned to stretch wire so tight it hummed in the wind. She wore men's trousers under her skirt for the heavy work, scandalizing the occasional peddler but earning the silent nod of Gus and the hands. One afternoon, late in August, she was on the roof, nailing shingles. The sun was beating down, the smell of heated pine tar thick in the air. She stopped to wipe the sweat from her eyes and looked out. The valley was greening up after a late summer rain. The sagebrush was a sea of silver, rolling in waves under the wind. The distant mountains were sharp and purple against the blue sky. For the first time since she had stepped off the stagecoach, the size of the landscape did not make her feel small. It made her feel free. She saw the beauty of it now. She saw the way the light changed the color of the cliffs from red to gold as the sun moved. She heard the song of the meadowlark, a piercing sweetness that cut through the constant wind. She saw the cattle grazing in the distance, not as dumb beasts, but as life, as wealth, as the future. Eli climbed the ladder to join her, carrying a canteen of water. He sat beside her on the slope of the roof, looking out at the same view. "You should come down," he said. "The sun is fierce." "I am fine," she said, taking the canteen. Eli watched her drink. He looked at the freckles that had bloomed on her nose, at the strength in her arms, at the confident way she sat on the high roof. The ghost of his dead wife, the specter that had haunted him for so long, had faded. In her place was this woman, this warrior who smelled of sawdust and sweat. "You are good at this," he said. "I have to be." She smiled, handing the water back. "I have a very demanding foreman." Eli chuckled, a sound that was becoming more frequent in the house. "I reckon you do." They sat there for a long moment, their shoulders touching. "I used to hate this view," Maggie admitted. "I used to think it was trying to swallow me. And now, she said, looking at the horizon, "I think it is just holding its breath, waiting to see if we are strong enough to stay." "We are," Eli said. As the leaves on the cottonwoods turned to gold, the rhythm of their life settled into something steady and deep. The frantic desperation of the early days was gone, replaced by a quiet companionship. They no longer slept with a foot of cold space between them. The nights were growing cool, but the bed was warm. They claimed each other with a passion that had lost its edge of fear, but none of its intensity. It was a slow, savoring love now. They made love with the windows open to the night air, not caring if the wind heard them. They were husband and wife, partners, lovers, and friends. In the evenings, after the chores were done, they would sit in the parlor. The new wallpaper was a cheerful yellow, bought from the catalog with the first profits of the restructured loan. Eli would clean his guns or mend tack, and Maggie would read aloud from the book she had ordered. Dickens, mostly, or poetry by Tennyson. One rainy night in October, a wagon rattled into the yard. It was the Swensons, the family whose homestead had burned. They were moving on, heading to Oregon. But they had a passenger they could not take with them. "He is a stray," Mr. Swenson explained, standing awkwardly in the kitchen, holding his hat. "Found him hiding in our root cellar after the fire. Says his name is Toby. Says his folks died of the fever on the trail last winter. We cannot feed another mouth on the road. Eli, we barely have enough for our own." Eli looked at the boy. Toby was perhaps 10 years old, skinny as a rail, with hair the color of straw and eyes that were too old for his face. He stood by the door, shivering in a coat that was 3 sizes too big, waiting to be sent away. Maggie looked at him, and her heart stopped. She saw the hunger in his shoulders. She saw the terrified stillness of a child who expects the world to hurt him. She saw her sister, Sarah, standing in the cold of a New York street. She dropped the dish rag she was holding and walked over to him. She knelt down so she was eye level with the boy. "Hello, Toby," she said. The boy did not answer. He stared at her boots. "Do you know how to peel potatoes?" she asked. The boy blinked, surprised by the question. "Yes, ma'am." "Good," she said, standing up, "because I have a bushel of them, and my husband has an appetite like a bear. If you help me with supper, you earn a seat at the table. Does that sound fair?" Toby looked at Eli. Eli looked at the boy, then at Maggie. He saw the fierce set of her jaw. He saw the love that had nowhere to go, suddenly finding a target. "It sounds fair to me." "Son," Eli said, "put your bag in the bunkhouse, but you sleep in the loft tonight. It is warmer." Toby stayed. He was not a talkative child. He worked hard, desperate to earn his keep, terrified that one mistake would put him back on the road. But slowly, under Maggie's relentless warmth, he began to thaw. She mended his clothes. She cut his hair. She taught him to read in the evenings, her finger tracing the words in the Bible while he sounded them out. She treated him not like a servant, but like a sacred trust. One evening, Toby dropped a heavy crock of milk. It shattered on the floor, sending white liquid splashing across the clean wood. The boy froze, curling his shoulders in, bracing for a blow. Maggie didn't yell. She didn't raise a hand. She simply sighed. "Well," she said, "the cat will be happy." She handed him a rag. "Help me clean it up, Toby, and watch for the shards." Toby looked at her, his eyes wide. You ain't gonna whip me." Maggie stopped. She looked at the boy, and her heart broke for all the jagged edges of his short life. "We don't hit people in this house, Toby," she said firmly. "We fix things. That is what Mercers do." The boy began to cry, silent, shaking sobs. Maggie pulled him into her arms, pressing his face against her apron, rocking him until the shaking stopped. Eli, watching from the doorway, felt a lump in his throat the size of a fist. He realized then that they were not just rebuilding a ranch. They were building a family. The town changed. Too, it was slow, like the turning of a heavy wheel. The story of Maggie's ride to Granite Peak had become something of a legend. The men who had leered at her now tipped their hats with genuine deference. They respected grit, and Maggie O'Rourke had more grit than half the men in the territory. The women were harder to win over, but necessity is a powerful bridge. The winter was coming, and it promised to be hard. Mrs. Miller, the blacksmith's wife, came to the ranch one day with a bundle of wool coats that were moth-eaten and torn. "I heard you have a hand with a needle." "Mrs. Mercer," she said, her eyes on the floor. "I cannot pay much, but I can pay in eggs and butter." "I will do it," Maggie said. She sat up late into the nights, her fingers flying over the wool. When she returned the coats, they were better than new. Word spread. Soon, Maggie was sewing for half the town. In November, the invitation came. The quilting circle met on Tuesdays in the church vestry. Mrs. Higgins sent a note, formally inviting Mrs. Eli Mercer to join them. Maggie was terrified. She dressed with painstaking care. When she walked into the room, the conversation died. 12 pairs of eyes turned to her, but she did not look down. She walked to an empty chair, sat down, and pulled her needle from her case. "I brought my own thimble," she said into the silence. "Mrs." Higgins smiled, a small, genuine cracking of her severe face. "That is good, Mrs. Mercer. We are working on a Star of Bethlehem pattern. It is tricky. I like tricky patterns," Maggie said. And just like that, the circle opened, and she was let in. She was not fully one of them. She would always be the woman from New York, the woman with the shadow of a past, but she was no longer an outcast. She was a neighbor. The winter came and went, fierce and howling, burying the ranch in 4 feet of snow. But the house was tight. The woodpile was high. And the three of them, Eli, Maggie, and Toby, sat by the stove, safe and warm, listening to the wind that could no longer hurt them. Spring arrived with a riot of wildflowers. The valley exploded in color, bluebells, Indian paintbrush, and the yellow blaze of arrow-leaf balsam root. One evening in May, when the work was done, Eli saddled 2 horses. "Come with me," he said to Maggie. "Where are we going?" "Just ride." They rode up the trail behind the house, climbing higher and higher until they reached the ridge that overlooked the entire valley. The sun was setting, a magnificent collision of orange and purple and blazing gold. Below them, the ranch lay spread out like a map. The house was glowing with the warm yellow light of oil lamps. Smoke curled lazily from the chimney. In the corral, the cattle were lowing softly. They could see Toby walking along the fence line, a stick in his hand. The old ranch dog trotting faithfully at his heels. It was a picture of peace. It was a picture of a life that had been fought for, bled for, and won. Maggie reined in her horse. She leaned into Eli, her leg brushing against his. Her heart felt so full it was almost painful, a sweet, aching pressure in her chest. She looked at the vastness of the Wyoming sky. It was huge. It stretched from one end of the world to the other, covering everything: the graves, the burnt timber, the new grass, the old scars. "It is too big," she whispered. The words slipped out, an echo of that night in the barn when she had been terrified and desperate. Eli turned to look at her. He didn't flinch this time. He didn't pull away. He looked at her with eyes that were crinkled at the corners with love and sun. "Too big for what?" he asked softly. Maggie smiled. Tears pricked her eyes, but they were not tears of sadness. They were tears of relief. "It is too big for the small stories," she said, her voice trembling. "Too big for the whispers in town. Too big for the shame I carried for so long. Too big for Silas Crane's hate." She looked at him, her gaze locking onto his. "But it is finally big enough," she whispered. "It is big enough for us, big enough for this love we fought so hard to keep." Eli reached out. He wrapped his hand around the back of her neck, pulling her toward him. "It is just the right size," he murmured. He kissed her. It was a long, unhurried kiss. It tasted of the wind and the sage and the evening cool. Their bodies pressed together against the saddles, 2 silhouettes outlined against the dying fire of the sun. If anyone had looked up from the valley floor, they would have seen them. 2 riders on the ridge, merging into one shadow. The world had tried to separate them. The snow had tried to freeze them. The fire had tried to burn them. A rich man had tried to buy them. But they were still here. As the first stars began to prick the violet sky, Eli broke the kiss. He smiled at her, a look of pure, unguarded happiness. "We should get back," he said. "Toby will be hungry." Maggie nodded, wiping her eyes. "And we have to check the new calves in the morning." They turned their horses and began the slow ride down the slope, back toward the lights of their home. They talked quietly as they rode. They talked of the harvest to come. They talked of teaching Toby to ride. They talked of maybe, next year, filling the spare room with a crib. They rode into the darkness, but they were not afraid of it anymore. They carried their own light. They were Eli and Maggie Mercer, and they had built a love that was finally, truly, bigger than their pain. Thank you so much for listening to this story. It has been a long journey from the crowded streets of New York to the vast plains of Wyoming, and I am grateful you rode along with Eli and Maggie. I would love to know where you are listening from today. Are you watching the sunset in Arizona? Drinking coffee in London? Or maybe taking a break in Tokyo? Please leave a comment below and share your location and your thoughts on the story in English. If you enjoyed this tale of grit, survival, and love in the American West, please consider subscribing to From Wild West. There are many more stories to tell, stories of outlaws and lawmen, of hardship and hope, and of the people who forged a life on the frontier. Until next time, keep your fences strong and your heart open.